Welcome. In this video, we'll be analyzing Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 to 39. These verses provide us with a description of Antiochus IV. But what truly makes these verses fascinating isn't so much their content, but rather their position in the text. As right before this description of Antiochus, we have a very thorough and accurate account of history. And then directly after this description of Antiochus, we have an inaccurate account of history. So verses 36 to 39 separate the accurate from the inaccurate history. And as we've spoken about in previous videos, most scholars will claim that the book of Daniel was written in this time period, so about 165 BC. And that does make a lot of sense, since it explains why verses 3 to 35 are historically accurate, because Daniel is accurately recording past events. And it also explains why verses 40 to 45 are historically incorrect, as Daniel inaccurately predicts future events. In describing verses 36 to 39 and their placement in the text, Newsom writes the following in her commentary. These verses interrupt the historical narration in order to focus on the person of Antiochus, and in particular, his relationship with deity. They come at a strategic place, since the final section, verses 40 to 45, contains the actual historical prediction based on the understanding of the dynamics of divinely determined history developed throughout the chapter. Newsom continues to write, quote, "What these verses serve to explain is why the pattern of containment will be ruptured. Previous kings had challenged one another, but now this king has challenged heavenly powers," end quote. So, as Newsom writes, the reason why we have a description of Antiochus here is because Daniel needs to demonstrate that Antiochus is so much worse than his predecessors. So remember our timeline here. Daniel 11 has recorded the consistent conflicts between the northern and southern kings. And the kings that ruled during this period were sinful men, as they were challenging their fellow kings. But now Antiochus IV comes on the scene. And he doesn't merely challenge men, but rather he challenges God himself. Thus, verses 36 to 39 present Antiochus as more evil than his predecessors, which ruptures history and ushers in the apocalypse. Okay, it's now time to read verse 36. It reads, quote, "The king shall act as he pleases. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god, and shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods. He shall prosper until the period of wrath is completed, for what is determined shall be done." End quote. Now, one of the most obvious ways that Antiochus exalted himself was his title Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which means God manifest. Now, while all of Antiochus' predecessors also had titles, none were as blasphemous as his own. For instance, his brother Seleucus IV was known as Philopater, which means father lover. His grandfather, Seleucus III, was known as Soranus, meaning thunderbolt, and his great-grandfather, Seleucus II, was known as Cassinius, meaning beautiful victor. Hopefully you can see that Antiochus' title of God Manifest is starkly different from his predecessors, and incredibly blasphemous, especially from a Jewish point of view. Newsom writes in her commentary, quote, "More significantly, although the title God, Greek theos, had been previously used to honor Seleucid monarchs, Antiochus IV was the first to exploit this designation as a part of his popular image." She continues to write, "Some of his coins used the title, quote, Basilius Antiochus Theo Epiphanes. I do not speak Greek. I'm sure I mispronounced every word there. But what that means is Antiochus the king, God manifest." Newsom continues to write, "Since coins were a major means by which imperial self-representation was propagated, it would be likely that the author of Daniel was aware of these claims and considered them blasphemous." End quote. Let's now spend some time analyzing some of Antiochus's coins. And what we're going to see is that the coins created early in his reign were not blasphemous, but then over time they became very blasphemous. For instance, when we look at this early coin and we have a look at the back of it, and we look at the inscription, we can see we have the words Basilius, which means king, and Antiochus. So King Antiochus. Nothing very blasphemous there, just kind of stating the facts. But now let's put that coin away and look at a coin produced later on in his reign. We'll have a look at the back inscription, and we're still going to see Basilius Antiochus, so King Antiochus, but now we have another title added to it. And what this says is God manifest. So as you can see, as time progresses, his coins are becoming more blasphemous. Let's now put this one away and look at our final coin here, one produced later on in his reign. And again, when looking at the back inscription, we have King Antiochus again. We also have God manifest, but now Antiochus has added yet another title for himself. You can see it right here. Again, I do not speak Greek. I do not know how to pronounce that, but it says Nikophos, which means victory bringer. And this was actually a designation that Zeus used to describe himself. So again, even more blasphemous. So hopefully you can see here that Antiochus's coins start off not very blasphemous, but then over time become very blasphemous. As the following author writes, quote, "The inscriptions on Antiochus IV coins provide a background to this verse. The early coins have the simple inscription of King Antiochus. This gradually expands to of King Antiochus, God manifest victory bringer, which is found on coins from 169 BC on. Alexander the Great and his successors were given some divine honors, but Antiochus IV was the first to use the epithet God on his coins, and by adding manifest epiphanies, he strengthened the claim to identification with the deity. Victory bringer was one of the epithets used of Zeus." End quote. Let's now move on to verse 37, which reads, quote, "He shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors or to the one beloved by women. He shall pay no respect to any other god, for he shall consider himself greater than all." End quote. Now, there's a lot going on in this verse, so let's just focus on the first part here. He shall pay no respect to the god of his ancestors. Siao writes in his commentary, quote, "According to the narrator, Antiochus had no consideration of the god of his ancestors, meaning probably the god Apollo, the patron deity of the Seleucids. The appearance of Zeus instead of Apollo on some of the coins minted during his reign may have suggested to some in his time that he was favoring Zeus at the expense of the god of his forebears. That may not have been Antiochus's intention in depicting Zeus, but it made for good polemics." End quote. We can again see this by looking at his coins. So if we look at an early coin from Antiochus, you can see that the image on the back is that of the god Apollo, and this was the patron god of the Seleucid Empire. But if we then look at a coin later on in his reign, we can see that instead of Apollo, we instead have the god Zeus here. So as you can see, we have this transition from the early coins having Apollo to the later coins having Zeus. Now, in the eyes of a faithful Jew, this would have been seen as a rejection of Apollo. But remember, Antiochus is a pagan and worshipped multiple gods, so this need not be some sort of rejection of Apollo. As Newsom writes in her commentary, quote, "The general gist of the accusation is that Antiochus abandoned the worship of other gods, including the ancestral god of the Seleucid dynasty, Apollo. This is simply not the case. In 166, Antiochus staged a spectacular festival and procession at the sanctuary of Apollo at Daphne near Antioch. A special coin was issued honoring Apollo, and the procession featured the statues of many deities." Newsom continues to write, "It is the case, however, that the mint at Antioch, as early as 173-172, had replaced the figure of Apollo on the reverse of Antiochus's coins with the figure of a seated Zeus Olympus, though other mints retained the traditional image." Newsom continues, "Perhaps this was sufficient for the author of Daniel to have derived the impression that Antiochus's veneration of Zeus, Olympus, amounted to a rejection of Apollo, since within Judaism one could not honor a second god without betraying one's ancestral deity." End quote. Okay, let's now move on to the next part of this verse. I'll read the full verse again and highlight the part we'll be focusing on now. It says, "He shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors or to the one beloved by women." Okay, what on earth does that mean? What does it mean that he paid no respect to the one beloved by women? Well, most commentators are going to say that this is a reference. Are you enjoying this video so far? Do you want to watch the rest of it? Well, the only way for you to do that is to become a patron. The full video is only available to patrons. So click the link in the description below and become a patron today.